Hello. Thank you so much, Umesh, for a very detailed introduction. So, thank you for all of us who have joined us today. And it's a really interesting session we intend to have. Um, but before that, if I could request, like, if people are there, just to have like a more concerted discussion, if you would like willingly, I would suggest that you come a little bit ahead, so you are also part of the conversation. So that's a completely voluntarily thing, but if you would like to do that. So with that, I would like to start calling our esteemed panelists and experts today. So let me first bring in Mr. Hamza Ali Haroon. He's Regional Director, South Asia, Climate Vulnerable Forum and Vulnerable 20 Group, V20. He has quite a big background in politics as well, so we'll surely try to reel that in while we have that in our discussion. Then we have Dr. Tatiana Lancina, Project Manager, Power System Transformation from Agora Energiewende. And she has been also previously the CEO of Global Number 7 Association, which kind of like promotes voluntary carbon reduction in corporates. Then we have Ms. Hannah Sophia Guento, Associate Professional, IRENA. She has been working closely with the national government in Philippines as well. And she's currently working on SDG 7, Just Transitions and RE Finance. And then we also have Dr. Aisha Ali. She's Assistant Professor LUMS. She has done her PhD and is focused on power markets and electricity. And then lastly, we are also joined by Ms. Christina Ang, Managing Director, Energy Shift Institute from Indonesia. She has been working in negotiating with different development partners around climate finance as well. So welcome to you all. Welcome to all the panelists, and glad to have you guys here. So since the time is less, let's just dive deep into our discussions, and I would really like to get as much input from you guys as possible. So let me start off, we'll take a little bit help from one of our panelists, Dr. Tatiana first, to kind of allow us to set a context a little bit in terms of, what the progress have been in Asia overall regarding energy transition. And if you can highlight a little bit of energy transition gaps for us, so that kind of like sets a context for us to further conversation as well. So I'll give that job to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it would be great if my slides will be shown on the screen. So actually, the next, please. Actually, Asia is just beginning its wonderful journey in the sphere of energy transition. And in many countries, renewables comprise just several percent so far of generation. So as you can see at this slide, yeah. The leader is China. In China, we have about 15% of solar and wind generation in the total generation. And globally, if we compare, it's a little bit higher than 13%. Vietnam is also a bit higher than the world average, and all other Asian countries are very much below this global average level. And if we take a look at the coal on the other side, we can see that the global average is about 40% of generation. And in many Asian countries, especially the largest ones, the share of coal is much higher than 40%. Like, for example, in China, it is higher than 60%, in India, higher than 70%. In Mongolia, it's very high. So it means that energy transition is just starting in the region, and one of the most important aspects for many countries of the region is how to transit from coal to renewables. And you can see that at the same time, while many Asian countries are already starting to develop renewables, they still build a lot of coal power plants. You can see it on the right side of this slide. Almost all power plants that are planned, coal power plants, they are in the Asian regions, and other continents do not plan to build much new coal. And what does it mean for financing of energy transition? It means that since the priorities are still with traditional energy, with coal energy, The major barrier is not that there is a lack of finance or lack of different financial instruments, but the problem is that many countries are still not ready. They have not taken a political decision to do this energy transition. Even despite the economics that are already supporting renewables, despite the fact that solar and wind are the cheapest sources of energy at the moment, and in some cases, in some countries, they are already able to compete with old coal power plants that have already paid off. Even despite those facts, it is very difficult to change the system and to change the financial flows. Why is it happening so? First of all, coal and other fossil fuels provide a lot of economic benefits at the moment. They provide economic growth, both national and regional. Regional is especially because many regions are very dependent on coal mining, on producing coal power, etc., etc. They also provide employment, thousands and thousands of jobs. And in many countries, well, the system was built several decades ago, the energy system. And now, if you try to transform it, you need huge investments. And these investments are needed not only for power itself, but also in some countries for heating. In some countries also on the infrastructure like grids and heat systems. So it means when we speak about energy transition, we need to understand that it is much more than just installing some solar and wind power plants. And in terms of investments, it's also much more. And of course, there is a lot of inertia in the sector. So many companies and many decision makers, they know a lot about traditional energy systems. They know a lot, for example, about coal power plants, but they do not trust much to variable renewables because, well, you have the sun during the day, then you have no sun at night. You need to balance all these things. And many companies just do not believe that solar and wind can become a backbone of the new energy system. And of course, in many countries, especially those that mine a lot of coal themselves, coal is very cheap, it is subsidized, and even you have a lot of financial instruments available for wind and solar. In such a case, it will be still very difficult for them to compete with very, very cheap and very, very supported coal. And so the major gaps are that we need to focus on coal phase out in many countries. Or at least at making coal power plants, if we still preserve them in the system, then they should become more flexible so that they could help to integrate more renewables. So in any case, coal should either go out or help to develop renewable energy. There is a lack of flexible capacities, lack of storage. In many countries of Asia, there are aging grids. Of course, renewables themselves need a lot of investment and different services that are related to the integration of renewables into the grid, like forecasting, like storage, etc., etc. So you see that there are huge gaps, and all of these spheres they need a lot of investment, and they need specific financial instruments to help them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tatiana. And I think that's sets a context for us very right in terms of the overall progress how we see in towards Asia. So I'll bring Ms. Hannah into the conversation here, and you have been looking into the APAC region very closely. So we have mentioned, like, just Dr. Tatiana covered that really like gaps in $2 trillion US. So there is definitely a gap there, but it doesn't see the cost of solar and wind coming down, right? So the economics are working out, and then the transition and the financing needs are there. What are the major barriers that you see that leads to this financing gap not being fulfilled within that time?
This panel, I think what I'll be saying quite complements what Tatiana said earlier in her presentation. So let me start with a bit of context. The most recent number we got for energy transition investments in the Asia Pacific region has been really remarkable in terms of growth. And when I say energy transition investments, I mean investments going not just to renewables, but also energy efficiency, electric vehicles, power grids, and so on. So this number for the entire region was at somewhere between 940 and 980 billion US dollars. Because the amount of money going to energy transition technologies at the global level was at $2.1 trillion. This means that Asia Pacific accounts for almost half of the money going into renewables, electric vehicles, and so on. And if you contextualize that within total energy sector investments in the region, so this is money going into both clean and carbon intensive technologies, clean energy investments actually now make up almost 75% of that. Now, when we talk about the barriers, you can look more closely in the data. You'll see that if you take it at a more granular level, at a per country basis or even a sub-regional basis, you'll see a very different story. And that's a story of disparity. So the progress that we're seeing with energy transition investments, it's largely concentrated in some economies like China and advanced economies like Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. This to what the speakers earlier in the morning mentioned about the high cost of capital. And this is related to the many challenges that developing nations in the region face. And someone earlier emphasized macroeconomic context, which is very, very important and which makes it difficult for governments and utilities to attract sustainable debt financing for renewable energy projects. So just some common risks. It really depends per context and per country. And I'd also like to touch on one challenge which Dr. Tatiana also mentioned, and it's the continued investment in fossil fuels. So just some very helpful stats. Total energy sector investments goes to fossil fuel investments. So that's coal-related sectors. And you may think that this is a good number because it's quite low, but this translates to about 90% of global investments in coal. So let me just emphasize that. Asia Pacific invests in almost 90% of the money that's going into coal worldwide. And this translates to operations on the ground. 80% of the world's coal fleet is in Asia and Pacific. And as Tatiana emphasized, almost all of planned expansion will be in the region. So because of that, Asia Pacific now faces the highest risk of stranded assets. And I'm glad that we get to delve deeper into that tomorrow when we have that panel on coal phase out. And I'd like to end on one thing. Even if the growth in investments in renewables and other energy transition technologies has been remarkable in the region, it's still not enough. And that was also emphasized earlier in the presentations this morning. At least with IRENA's estimates, we would need at least 150 trillion US dollars by 2050 so that we can meet our goals. And these goals can be on SDG 7 on universal energy access. It can also be related to the recent tripling renewable energy capacity goal at COP28. And of course, this stems from the Paris Agreement, how to make sure that we remain in a climate safe pathway, one that limits global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. I'll stop there and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists.
Thank you so much. And I think you pointed really well in terms of the disparity that is there and the need for mobilizing that additional finance. And I think that was also resonated early in the presentation by Hessam regarding 5 times of the climate finance that needs to be mobilized. And that brings me to Harun, Hamza, to you as well. You have been looking into this, very closely into this needs of these vulnerable countries in terms of what is needed to get them to their climate change goals. So my question to you is, we have been looking into the climate finance, the commitments are there. Number one, we know that those commitments are not enough. We have gone through in the morning session, but at the same time, the commitments that are there, 100 billion US dollars. We don't see them getting mobilized. We don't see these developing economies having that access to kind of finance. I mean, if we take example of Pakistan in the GCF, we have seen that less than $200 billion have been mobilized in past 10 years. So how do you see what are the major issues and critical areas that needs to we need to address in order globally to meet our energy transition goals, perhaps?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, thank you so much to LUMS, to all the organizations involved. Thank you for allowing us to come and speak to you. And thank you for showing up. You could have been anywhere, but you chose to be here with us. So thank you for that. So before I get down deep into the technicalities of things, let me just ask you all to take a step back and see what's going on. So my organization is a independent intergovernmental organization that is of 70 members now. 70 climate vulnerable countries are part of this organization. This organization represents the global south of the world. And I am looking after the South Asia region for this organization. And here's what I see. I see that the patients across my region have all the same symptoms, but different complexities. And what are the symptoms? The symptoms are high debt, high cost of capital, and then a continuous cycle of needing more debt to have development and climate outcomes fixed. And then on top, they have climatic impacts, which could be slow onset impacts, or they could be episodic impacts. So what I see, and what I really would love for you to see, is that this region is going through a climate debt trap. And they're finding it very hard to come out of it. If you look at Maldives, same situation. If you look at Bhutan, same situation. Everyone's going through the same thing. Let me give you another fact as well. There's a G20 report that came out in 2023, which said that in the developing countries, there's an increase of $68 billion that is going from developing countries to developed countries. So that increase led to $200 billion in 1 year going from developing countries to developed countries. V20, my organization, has estimated that in the next 8 years, from 2022 to 2030, $1 trillion is going to go from developing countries, climate vulnerable countries, to developed countries. So you're seeing that this high cost of capital, high debt, is reducing the fiscal space needed for actual development. So now what happens? Now we basically have to understand that how do we end this climate debt trap? Now, the way we look at it, and we'll talk about this, Basit, as we've discussed this before, about the international finance architecture. I would love to go into detail into that. The second part is, how do we move these climate vulnerable countries towards climate prosperity? How do we have the right amount of strategy internally so they can go and ask the private sector across the world, which is sitting on trillions of dollars, to come and invest so that these countries can stop this cycle and see progress towards prosperity? So one of the things that we've done, we've already created 4 climate prosperity plans, which have identified over $200 billion worth of projects that are bankable projects that have impacts on climate and development outcomes, which can actually chart a better course for these countries to move towards prosperity. So to answer your question in short, we need better planning. We need climate prosperity plans. We need national resource mobilization plans. These are not just textbooks that are sitting in government offices. These are national investment strategies that really tell anyone who says, I make a joke out of it. I say, if Bill Gates comes tomorrow to Pakistan and says, or to Bhutan or to Nepal and says, I have $100 billion, where do you want to spend it? Honestly, some of our countries don't have an answer. They will look at them and say, okay, well, you can give it to as a budget request, but no one has really clarity in this. And one of the things that we were able to do in Bangladesh, for example, was there was a project that was sitting for years, and we were able to find an investor that invested $1.4 billion in an offshore wind farm, which is going to provide 500 megawatts of electricity to Bangladesh. So that is the kind of things that you need to do. And just to give you a context on this climate debt trap, Bangladesh used the climate prosperity plans to go to RSF, to go to RST. Because, here's what we need to understand. Once you go to IMF or World Bank, you need to show some level of planning. You can't go and say, look, bad things happen to Pakistan, we're ground zero. You need to create a plan and show to the world that here's our strategy, here's why we need your money, and here's the return that you will see in the next 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years. Then you start going into the right direction. So I feel for this region, planning is missing. So once we get that sorted, I think we can chart a better course. But I would love to answer the second question on international financial architecture as well. Thank you.
Perfect. We'll get to that soon enough. So, and you said rightfully so, like this whole debt trap. And I'll take this example of Pakistan here because that's what we are mostly known about. And I'll take Dr. Aisha here. When we're talking about a country like Pakistan, these plans are significantly important. But at the same time, from the policymakers' perspective, the idea is we are always in a firefighting mode, right? We are always looking at this short-term decisions and this short-term overcoming the crisis, as it was discussed in the morning as well. How do you balance those short-term crises with the long-term energy transition goals? Because you have to be answerable for both, right? Long-term vision is there, but at the same time, how do you fit in the piece of solving this day-to-day or year-to-year basis crisis as they come go, specifically in the context of Pakistan, where we see the capacity payments crisis and all that? Would love to get your view.
Thank you, Basit. And let me first echo my thanks along with the panelists for you and all the organizers for putting together this really much needed panel and for the audience to be here to hear us. So I think this is, as the panelists have said, that there are kind of multiple layers to this problem. I'll focus on what we can do nationally, or what Pakistan can do for itself, right? And so I think just to kind of think of a bigger sort of context or perspective here first. So we do think and we know that international finance will be necessary to essentially support the energy transition for the developing countries. But what we also must not overlook is that we have to sort of carefully think of ways and means through which we can mobilize domestic private investment for be it mitigation or adaptation, right? So as you sort of begun to talk about the short-term versus long-term trade-offs, and you rightly said that we are really sort of in a firefighting mode, especially when we consider the energy sector and specifically the electricity sector, power generation, and the sort of entire sort of issue around circular debt and how the sector seems to be stuck in some kind of trap. And as Hamza was saying, this is, in my research, when I look at the electricity sector, it's essentially sort of like stuck in a trap. And we need a concerted effort, sort of big push approach to think creatively how to move out of this trap and to be able to sort of think towards our long-term priorities as well, while most of our time is sort of spent fixing our fiscal side or balance of payments. Needed for us to be able to break out of this trap is for us to as a nation realize the importance of climate change. It's not something one can argue what led to climate change, and we can assign blame and responsibility, but that's not of much help now. It's going to be the new normal for us, right? This is something which is staring at us in the face. So whatever we do in the short term, we have to build in the recognition that it has to sort of be consistent with a long-term plan or a long-term strategy, right? So that's the first thing, which I feel that we need to have this new sort of social compact, for lack of a better word, perhaps a new charter of I don't want to call it economy, but charter of, let's say, energy and sustainable development, maybe, where all of the stakeholders, ranging from the state to the private sector to the sort of companies involved in the energy sector, down to the sort of, the public level, us as consumers, we need to sort of understand and be rallying around a common objective that whatever needs to happen, both in the short term, it must be consistent with a long-term vision of being able to cope with climate change, right? And I sometimes think that it's actually a false dichotomy to think of, short-term versus long-term trade-off, especially if we consider Pakistan. Why is it a dichotomy? Well, our growth is actually tied to having low-cost energy available to us, right? And this is true both in the short term as well as in the long term. Okay? And our growth is tied to, for our communities, cities, rural areas to be resilient to climate disasters, both in the short term and in the long term, right? So these are just two examples. And, if I talk about the first one a bit more, and why is sort of, renewable energy or cleaner energy so important to us right now? Well, because traditional forms of energy have become so expensive for us, right? Consider the changes which have happened in the last 2 years. Our national grid is heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels, which have really skyrocketed in terms of, what it's costing us to generate electricity out of them. And thus, it's really imperative that we look for now, right, lower cost, which, thankfully happen to be greener energy sources, and sort of, do that now so that we can be prepared for the future as well, right? So, all to say that we need to really be considering a sort of overhaul of our thinking nationally. We don't need to sort of say that, we either sort of focus on short term or we do the long term. In fact, we need to build the long term goals into our short term strategies, whatever we might be doing. And, I'm thankful for forums such as these, because these allow us to sort of have discourse around these issues, which I, very much wish and hope, we could have sort of in more settings as well, which in which we can sort of, reach out at a wider scale to people in general, right? And to be able for us as a nation to understand the importance of sort of, having a short-term and long-term consistent sort of, pathway that's going to kind of pull us out of these traps, as Hamza was saying, and as we observe in sort of many aspects of the way energy sector is working, or even our economy is working. So that's what I think on the short term versus long term. That I'll stop there, and maybe we can come back to markets and specific reforms later.
Definitely, we'll come back to that. But before that, I mean, you mentioned about the when we're talking about the short term or long term, and specifically speaking in Pakistan's context, we see that the public finance, half of it is going for the interest payments and into the debt. And then the development sector finance is also kind of like conduit accordingly towards that level. But there is another domestic capital source which remains untapped. And that's where I wanted to bring Ms. Christina Ang into the conversation as well. And you have been looking into the Southeast Asian very closely. So, while there are gaps at the international level in the climate finance, as we talked about, but the domestic capital has also not been fully tapped into and fully not blocked. So how do you think, like, your view on this and how we can unlock this capital, and particularly around the role of domestic financial institutions in this, particularly around the kind of instruments that could be mobilized domestically or across the region as well? So how do you see these kind of role of FIs and regulators in terms of mobilizing the domestic capital for these energy transition goals?
Thanks, Basit. And that's a very important question, I think, for this part of the region, for the reasons that previous speakers have already mentioned. It's true that when we talk about financing energy transitions in places like Pakistan and Southeast Asia, emerging markets in general, global climate finance often takes center stage. But in reality, relying solely on international capital isn't enough. And in places like Pakistan and Southeast Asia, there are structural and systemic challenges. For example, political instability, foreign exchange risks, economic uncertainty. And these don't favor, it's not in the favor of these markets in foreign capital portfolios. So what we really need is a more sustainable approach. And to me, what that means is mobilizing domestic capital and engaging local financial institutions. But first, let's look at some of the challenges that we face in tapping domestic resources. Risk appetite, that's the first one. Local banks and financial institutions, they tend to be risk averse. Many of them are used to lending to established sectors like real estate or textiles, where they feel more comfortable. Renewable energy projects, on the other hand, are newer, involve unfamiliar technologies, and they often require longer repayment periods. So that's the first challenge. Second challenge is regulation. So a big issue is regulatory clarity, to be specific. When policies around renewable energy and its financing are inconsistent or unclear, local investors, I mean, foreign and local investors, they hesitate. They want to know if their investments will be protected or if the rules will change suddenly, right? So, and in some emerging economies, this unpredictability is a serious barrier to domestic investment and foreign investment. The third challenge is access to long-term capital. One of the major challenges is that renewable energy projects need long-term capital, but many local banks are focused on short-term lending, loans that are only for a few years rather than decades. And this creates a mismatch because renewable energy projects need potential capital, well, patient capital that can support them for the long haul. So I guess to your question, Basit, like, so how can local financial institutions step up and play a bigger role in driving energy transition investments, all within the task of working within the limitations of the country, right? And I'm referring to the structural systemic limitations. One idea which has been observed and has been deployed in places like Southeast Asia is using green bonds and green sukuk. So utilizing these instruments to fund renewable energy projects beyond hydropower, which I understand is what has been done in Pakistan, is worth considering, as Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Middle East, they have done all this. They've issued, and I think there's quite a big green sukuk market because of that as well. So how does this work? If a local bank were to issue green sukuk, where the proceeds go towards financing green projects, that could raise funds from individual investors or local pension funds, and therefore tapping into local savings and directing them toward financing solar and wind farms or any other clean energy projects. Now, this gives everyday people and the institutions a way to support the energy transition while also earning a return on their investment. Just one more example, which could be considered, is things like energy efficiency loans rolled out in Southeast Asia. It's an opportunity for local banks to encourage local businesses and households to transition to cleaner energy. These loans help people install solar panels on their roofs or help industries participate and upgrade to more energy efficient equipment by creating these specific products like that encourage energy efficiency. Local banks would make it easier also for industries and households to take part in the energy transition in a way that benefits both sides, actually. So the bank gets a stable loan customer because they're all domestic, and the customer also saves on energy costs. But I must say that to unlock all these potentials, the most important thing is regulatory reform. Governments can play a huge role by creating policies that reduce the risks for local banks. And whether that's through guarantees, tax incentives, or even creating special funds that encourage local institutions' investment in renewables. And finally, it's important to also remember that local financial institutions are often cautious because they don't have enough data or confidence in renewable energy projects. So governments can step in here by creating clear and consistent policies, offer guarantees or lower interbank interest rates for financing green projects, and work closely with banks to create the right financial product for what suits the domestic market. But it's not just financial policies in this case. I have to say a well-regulated energy market that unlocks project financing is necessary to give the domestic financial institutions the confidence that investing in clean energy infrastructure is safe in the market. So in short, unlocking domestic capital isn't just about getting banks on board. It's also about creating the right environment where local institutions feel safe to invest. Let me stop.
Important to point out that, the different de-risking strategies, that one is, okay, bring in some new instruments, but then there is also a supportive and enabling environment to get those done. And I wanted to get your feedback, Tatiana, be applied across the new and innovative instruments or lowering the cost of finance. How we tend to achieve that? What's the role of perhaps the development partners in unlocking this private capital locally and maybe catalyzing additional investments into this RE project? So would love to get your view on that.
Thank you very much for your question. And yeah, I think that the main goal of development banks is just to create an environment that would be supportive for private investments as well. And in many cases, it is pretty difficult to do for the reasons that were already discussed by the previous colleagues. So like high risks, high debt, many companies and many stakeholders are not very familiar with renewables, and there is a lack of debt, etc., etc. And actually, the action in every of these directions is needed, like to have access to better data, to improve the investment climate, to improve the image of renewables, to disseminate more information on that, because really, if about traditional energy, every person knows that there is traditional energy, there is coal, there is gas, etc. Not so many people, and especially professional energy people that come from traditional energy sector, they are actually often not very aware. And so these actions could eliminate a lot of risks, but also a lot of actions should be taken by at the state level and at the level of regions, because to invest in renewables, investors need safety. They need to be sure that they will be able to sell their electricity in the future for good price, and to not to make a loss. And for this reason, they need, for example, a PPA, an agreement that would make it sure that in the coming 10 or 15 or 20 years, they will get some certain money for every kilowatt hour. Also, well, if we compare it with the traditional energy sector has been supported by the government for decades through different kinds of subsidies. And renewables actually also need different kinds of subsidies. And if renewables had the same subsidies as traditional energy had for decades, now we would face a different world. Now we would have not 15% or 13% of solar and wind in the total global generation, but 87% of solar and wind in the global generation. Yeah, we need to turn the system upside down and provide different benefits, not to coal, not to oil, not to gas, but to solar, wind, and other renewables and different services that are needed to integrate renewables into the grid. Also, special attention should be paid to the market organization, because in many Asian countries, there are different distortions of market when it is not that easy to compete fairly, etc. When the whole organization of the market provides some barriers to the penetration of renewables. But first, again, I would put the political goals. So renewables should become political goals. Energy transition should become a very important, I don't know, a priority for the government. And if it is not a priority, then banks are not very aware of what it is and what risks are associated with it. Traditional businesses are not interested to invest because, well, they know their coal and gas business, but they do not understand how renewables function, etc. So first, the global, the governmental goals in each of these countries. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And coming over to the, you talked about the regulatory framework that's needed, and something that's specifically in Pakistan, we see there's a lot of regulatory impediments and reforms that are needed in order to unlock this new investment to the region. And particularly when we talk about, it was discussed in the morning as well, most of the utilities are owned by state-owned enterprises within this whole of the Asia region. And I think something of the similar sorts is in Pakistan. Now, there's talks about the privatization and all that as well, but at the same time, the market has not opened up as it has in the West and as in the Europe. That opens up a lot of opportunities for the renewables and the ancillary service to kind of pitch in. So I just wanted to get Dr. Aisha's comment. You have looked into very closely into the Pakistan's local market. We have CTBCM's competitive trading bilateral market coming up. So how do you see the reform and the urgency of that CTBCM? And plus, what other reforms are needed for the power sector, particularly to kind of get those new investments into the new area for the energy transition goals?
So about sort of attracting new investment and renewable investment or clean investment in energy sector, or specifically electricity generation, I'll break this up into two parts. So first, kind of thinking of grid scale investments, which would be sort of large scale projects, solar, wind, or bagasse or other renewable sources. And I'll talk a bit about what frameworks we have right now for integrating renewables into the sort of grid. And then I'll talk also about off-grid sort of sources, which I think are equally, if not more important, thinking of mobilizing domestic private investment here. So first, as you may be aware that, we really kind of had a switch in terms of the regime that we offer to investors for, new renewable energy generation capacity. So we used to have sort of these longer term tariff arrangements, feed-in tariffs, or sort of your, standard kind of power purchase agreements for 25, 30 years. And in 2017, we had a switch from that regime to essentially what's now called a competitive sort of, bidding regime or a reverse auction type of regime where, if the government wants to include, certain amount of renewable energy capacity into the grid, they'll issue a benchmark tariff, and then, investors would compete to, offer capacity, at that tariff or below that tariff. So the idea again, was to sort of really to prevent ourselves from being locked into, high cost, energy generation agreements. And as this technology has been, even in the last 5 years, costs have been dropping dramatically. So while the sort of sense in terms of kind of switching was right, and if you think about economically, but it did have effects in sort of shaking investor confidence. And you might, if you look at sort of what has happened to grid scale investments, we really don't have any new grid scale investments in renewable energy in the last maybe 5 to 7 years. And despite sort of last year the government really trying to kind of take a roadshow internationally of a specific sort of solar energy project, despite all of that, we could attract any domestic or foreign investor to essentially take part in that solar energy project. So and in the backdrop, we have, as you've said, this sort of framework of competitive trading and bilateral contracts, sort of being the new system under which we would have electricity being traded. So that's just a complex name for saying that instead of having long-term offer different prices depending on market conditions to the buyers, in this case those of the distribution companies, but ultimately they're selling to consumers, right? So ideally this kind of setup where there's more competition, right? So generation companies are competing with one another to offer the most attractive rates to the buyers. This should ideally bring down your cost of generation and ultimately the cost at which you're selling to the consumers. But we've had sort of a lot of difficulties in kind of thinking of the sort of date by which we would implement this. And a key reason for this is that, we have this, the circular debt problem, right? It's essentially a, what circular debt does is it creates a sort of crisis of, or sort of lack of confidence in the sector to function, financially, if it were to transition to enough that the buyers will pay for the electricity that they're procuring, right? In this case, the circular debt, as you may understand, is sort of originating from the fact that there are all these recoveries which are not being made for electricity sold and consumed, and that sort of cascades upstream and creates a huge sort of problem for all entities within the energy sector. So as long as that issue, which is sort of like a the payment crisis or lack of confidence in this market to function is going to be there, we will not see a transition to CTBCM or any sort of model where we can have more competition and hopefully be able to bring down the cost of energy. And thus thinking of what needs to be done, and this perhaps links back to my earlier comment, which was about sort of having a new charter of energy or sustainable development. Well, we need to get out of this trap, and there will be sort of many components of what we need to do. Well, one of the components will be thinking of what do we do with this expensive capacity that we have essentially procured, right? And most of it coming from fossil fuels. Well, how do we, while sort of maintaining our international commitments that we've given to different investors, how do we sort of think of a way in which we can sort of have our sector kind of emerge from this trap which it finds itself into. And this will not just sort of be like about renegotiating contracts with IPPs, in terms of the kind of capacity payments that we have essentially locked ourselves into, but will also sort of involve complementary sort of efforts. For example, thinking of distribution. We have very high transmission distribution losses, right? So not only do we generate expensive electricity, but we lose a lot of it, not just to technical losses, but also due to theft and unbilled consumption. So what do we need to do about that? And where is the will to really kind of tackle that? And I know, I'll just take, 1 or 2 minutes more. So as I was saying that, this will sort of need a multi-pronged approach for us to kind of emerge from this trap. We essentially sort of cannot just say that, government will do this or that, but all the actors have to kind of come together to allow us to emerge from here.
Well noted. And I think Now, I would like to shift a little bit on, what Hamza really likes to talk about. But before that, I'll allow the Hannah to set a context, because we have heard a lot in today's conversation about debt trap being kind of like one of the major impediments for all these countries to kind of reach their goals and arrange for this finance. So I wanted to get your feedback on, because of all these economies at the same time, and they have the development angle to it as well. So I wanted to get your feedback on how do you see their role in terms of handling the financial vulnerabilities of the countries, while at the same time allowing them to reach their energy transition goals. And based on that, I think that will set the context for Hamza as well, because he wants to speak so much about global finance architecture. So yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Basit, for this really important question. I'm glad it's being asked because I'd like to emphasize that it is a climate emergency that we're trying to tackle. And with the speed and scale that's needed for the energy transition to progress, private capital won't be enough. And public finance coming from MDBs and bilateral creditors will also be very important. Just a bit of context, when we were looking at the data in the last 10 years, the sources of financing for renewables, we saw that in the past decade, 75% of it came from private sources. And as the previous panelists mentioned, we know that private players will only invest in certain contexts in low risk environments that they can guarantee a steady stream of profits from. And this is where public financing will be very important to make the energy transition more equitable and inclusive, because this has led to the concentration of investment that I mentioned earlier. And because of this, only advanced economies get to benefit from the energy transition. And when I say benefit, I don't just mean reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's also about the jobs that come from the energy transition. It's also about building local value chains and boosting industry. So how do these MDBs and other development finance institutions come to play? They're already providing finance, but it's not enough. We track a certain indicator in SDG 7, and bear with me, it's a long title. It's called Public Financial Flows, International Public Financial Flows for Renewable Energy for Developing Countries. And this is money that comes from donor countries, either through their bilateral agencies or through multilateral platforms, that is spent in developing nations for renewable energy projects. And we found that in the last 8 years, it's been declining. In 2016, it was around $28 billion for all developing nations. And as of last year, it's almost half of that at $15 billion. So they were giving more, donor countries were giving more in 2016. And now in 2023, it's almost half of that. And this is very concerning. And this is where MDBs and other development finance institutions can fill the gap. But apart from, advocating for increasing the quantity of finance that comes for countries that need it the most, I'd also like to touch on the quality of finance, because the quantity is as important as the quality. And what I mean by this is that the data that we looked into and the sources of financing, we found that most of them come in the form of debt instruments. And these debt instruments were largely at par with the interest rates that you can find in the normal market rates. So when I speak about the quality of finance, these instruments need to further come in the form of more concessional loans, grants, and risk mitigation instruments. And what's happening now is we're seeing very little of it, and the public finance that's actually being spent is only sourced and spent domestically with very little international collaboration and support. So I very much also support some kind of restructuring the international financial architecture, and I look forward to listening to what Hamza says about that.
Yeah, and it's an important point, and an interesting stat at the same time as well, that the development assistance and the inflows are actually decreasing, and the quality is also, they're mostly debt-based. So that brings me to you, Hamza. We have seen that the traditional climate finance, to say the very least, have not been successful in mobilizing the required assistance. So I want you to highlight the key gap areas and where they lack and what can be done next.
Thank you so much. So I'll be quick because I know we're running out of time. So I'll hit the point straight up so you guys can get a feel for what needs to happen. I think a day back, there was a Bretton Woods 2.0 retreat. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. And, you know, I had to send some feedback into some of the thinkers that were having discussions there. And I basically said that the Bretton Woods institution needs to stop sleepwalking. Essentially, what has happened is that this Bretton Woods institution was formed in the 1940s, you know, revitalized in the 1970s due to the changing circumstances, but it hasn't changed after that. And what has happened is that there are now more players trying to get the same amount of pie, and it's not going to work. So the first thing that needs to happen is the rules of the game needs to be changed. I'll give you a very small example. The V20 countries, which is almost 70 countries, represents 1.74 billion people. And the IMF quota for these 1.74 billion people is 6.17%. So there's no representation. How can you expect things to get better when the most impacted countries have such little representation? So that's the first thing that needs to change. The rules of the game needs to be changed. The second thing is what Hannah also mentioned was the concessional financing. The cost of capital needs to come down. Now, what is concessional financing? You know, it's very easy to throw this term and say, okay, you know, we all need concessional financing. The definition that has been working for many countries in the V20 group is concessional financing is when your interest rates are lower than your medium long-term growth rates. If they're higher than that, there's a problem. And you're going to be stuck in this climate debt trap because it's going to keep on going on. And with the aggravated climate situation that our countries are facing, this is not sustainable. The second point within this is the MDBs need to understand that there needs to be a balance sheet optimization. Now, what do I mean by this? I went to Bhutan a couple of weeks back and I was speaking with their finance minister, and he said, you know, Bhutan has 20,000 megawatt of hydro dam capacity. That is equivalent to almost $40 billion investments needed. Now, what happens is when they go with all these projects to all these institutions, they look at Bhutan's GDP, their balance sheet, and say, you only have $2.5 billion. So now all of a sudden, their debt analysis tells them, which is based in the 1970s and 1940s, that they can only give them a specific amount of money, which does not meet the requirement of that $40 billion or 20,000 megawatt. So the balance sheet optimization needs to be there. And the last point is, how can you make debt work for climate? This is a very important point. How can we have climate investments baked into the current debt that is already facing these countries? Now, I know Dr. Wong was here. He had mentioned climate debt swaps. But that's one tactic, right? There are other tactics that you can use. Why don't we speak to the international finance architecture and tell them, look, IMF, you need to update your debt sustainability analysis, take into consideration the climate risks that these climate vulnerable countries face, the episodic events that these climate vulnerable countries are facing, and then come up with the rate and then come up with the balance sheet optimization. So in this way, you make debt work for climate. So for me, the three recommendations are very simple. You know, have the rules of the games must change. The cost of capital needs to come down, and we need to make sure that the debt works for the climate. So I'll end there, and I hope that answered your question.
I think it does. It's actually pretty clear, and we've got a lot of recommendations for a breakout room next in the session as well. I think Zan will be looking into that. So I think half of your job is done, Zan. So that brings me to my last question before we open the questions for the general audience. And there's just one aspect I think which remained untouched during our conversation, and I wanted to bring Christina into that. We're talking about mostly into the financing for the RE and bringing new generation. But at the same time, we have seen earlier, as well as Tatiana was showing, there's a substantial coal fleet, that's there out there in the Asia. And the discussion on the coal phase out, there have been somewhat going on in the South Asian region, but also at the same time in Pakistan, we see some of those discussions not going forward at the same time. So I wanted to get your feedback on how we can make these particular instruments, how we can make them more commercially bankable, to make them more acceptable to the policymakers and the other people, decision makers of different Asian regions as well.
Yeah, thanks, Basit. I mean, both ETMs and JETPs, they're very ambitious, right? So, I mean, they aim to accelerate the shift from coal to renewables. And by that, what that means is retiring coal plants early by refinancing or buying out the coal plants, the coal owners, and allowing the replacement with renewable energy in a socially fair way, protecting the workers and communities. So the question about, how effective these initiatives are, in theory, ETMs and JETPs, they offer a promising way forward, but these are not simple transactions. I mean, just thinking about what they're meant to do, they are very complex mechanisms. And there's been a gap, I think, between expectations and the reality of what JETPs and ETMs can achieve in a short period of time for phasing out coal. Now these frameworks are often viewed as quick solutions, but they require time, strong governance, sustained financing, which were perhaps initially underestimated. So I guess, the challenges that have been faced so far, number one is financing and incentives. For initiatives like JETP and ETM to succeed, we need massive amounts of funding. Retiring coal plants early is expensive, just full stop. It's just expensive. And the key question here is, who will pay? Who will pay for that? Now, wealthier nations and the international financial institutions, they need to come through with the promised funds. And if financing falls short, these programs, they won't work. And the financial incentives itself for coal plant owners, they must be attractive enough for them to agree to an early shutdown. So I think there's a lot of complexities already in the financing and incentives here. I think the other challenge is political will and support. Governments in countries like Indonesia, they need to be fully on board. The same with Pakistan. And strong political will, consistent policy frameworks, these are crucial to show that political will. Unfortunately, we often see a lack of policy clarity and a lack of long-term commitment. And this is something that the earlier speakers have already mentioned. So then this makes it difficult for initiatives to gain traction. So if the political environment is unstable, or if regulations keep changing, then investors and bilateral investors, they're going to be hesitant to put their money in these programs. And then obviously the third challenge is the social and economic transition part. Perhaps that's the biggest challenge. It's ensuring that the transition is socially just. And many people in Indonesia, Pakistan, because they rely on coal for their livelihoods, if we just simply shut it down without offering new jobs, there'll be serious consequences. And so for JETPs to work, we need to invest in reskilling workers, building new industries in the coal-dependent regions, and ensuring that communities aren't left behind. Now, this goes back to something that an earlier speaker also mentioned, planning, right? So I think and that's what we are noticing, I think, in many Southeast Asian markets that are, thinking about or have JETPs underway. It's that early planning is actually missing. So what steps can we take then to ensure these initiatives are successful? Number one, unlock more financing. I think we need to think beyond traditional financing methods. I mean, it's not just about international funds, right? It's local banks, private sector players, they all need to step up. Number two, strengthen policy commitment. I think we need the governments to set clear long-term policies for phasing out coal. I think this has been repeated throughout this panel already. But this really includes setting realistic timelines for plant closures. and offering tax incentives for renewable energy investments, ensuring that the regulations don't shift unexpectedly. These are really important to give, and that consistency will give investors confidence, foreign and domestic. And finally, I mean, I don't have to elaborate on this. The transition just has to be fair. I think that's the next step that we really need to do. Again, I reiterate that this needs to come with proper planning, short and long term. So yeah, I think hopefully, Basit, I answered the question, but ETMs and JETPs, they offer a roadmap for transitioning away from coal that's both environmentally and socially responsible, but their success really just hinge on adequate financing, clear government policy, and a focus on fairness.
Thank you so much, Christina, and I think that really covers it well. So yeah, I mean, you're also out of time after me, but I wanted to. Yeah. So we're almost out of time. They're telling me that, but I do want to take a couple of questions if that's we do have 5 minutes or so. We have so many questions. I'll just take two quickly and I'll ask the panelists to just try to sum it up in like a half a minute or so. So maybe one from the Assam and whether.
Thank you. Okay, I'll be quick. So off the bat, I want to state that I'm asking this question in a personal capacity, and what I might imply would not necessarily reflect CPI's view. So Christina, you talked about leveraging Sukuk bonds, and gave very tangible recommendations for how we can mobilize savings in domestic markets. And I think that's really critical within the context of debt, right? And so. I guess this question is to both you and Hamza. My feeling is that an overhaul and reform of the international financial architecture is precisely what is needed, and without that critical condition being met, we will not be able to create the enabling environment to get to scale, both in the context of mitigation, but especially in the context of adaptation finance, especially in the context of adaptation finance. So, I mean, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on what exactly is it, that you mean when you talk about the reform of the international financial architecture. What are, say, the 2 or 3 highest impact interventions that need to happen today for us to get to where we want to be?
Christina, would you like to respond to that?
Perhaps Hamza can.
Okay, sure. I think it sums up.
Thank you so much, Hazel, for such a good question. I think this is you're trying to get to the root of it, which is great. See, the first thing that needs to happen is the Bretton Woods institution, which is kind of we're following them, right, in a way. Whatever the conditionality is, and if you look at how the IMF works, right, there's the technical aspect and then the conditionality aspect. And there are only few success stories so far who have gone through the IMF program, and I'm being very specific here, and have had some level of success. I think there was one country in Africa which found success, forgetting the country's name, but so there needs to be a reevaluation of, okay, maybe this is not working, right? Maybe what we did in 1970s is a wonderful book by Martha Finmore, in which she talks about what happened to IMF from 1940s all the way to 1980s, and what was the change that really helped, because at that time, a lot of countries were going bankrupt, a lot of countries were asking for they were going through crisis and they needed some money flowing in so that their balance of payment was corrected, and then they could, move forward towards development. Now, all of a sudden, the climate angle has brought in new problems for these countries. So one of the ways IMF discusses how to deal with the country is the debt sustainability analysis, right? That really frames their thinking of what steps need to happen for a particular country for us to help them. The problem is, and this is where we talk a lot about, is in that sustainability analysis, there's no mention of climate. There's no mention of slow onset events that could happen in Bhutan, that could happen in Nepal. In Nepal, tourism is being affected because of what is happening with climate change, right? Everett's the base camp has gone down like 400 something feet already. So these impacts are not being taken account into the debt sustainability. And so that is one thing that needs to happen in the international financial architecture, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. And just quickly, in a minute, we have this last question. They're just telling me about the time. I'm already gone over. So
thank you very much. All the panelists has, I think, very, precisely and accurately bring the climate financing. The only thing which I think the CTBCM, one of the lead designer, and one of the statement has been, I think, mentioned over here, the CTBCM, because of the circular debt, was going to be not having market transactions to be happen quickly. So that's clarification I want to bring, because CTBCM is a bilateral contract market where the collateral system works for all the transactions which are going to be happen at the imbalance markets. The circular debt will not going to affect those transactions. So it is going to be, I think, for my duty to be over here to clarify that aspect. Yes, the bilateral contract market does not have any impediments or effects because of the current circular debt situation, and that's what one of the challenge when we are designing that part.
Yep. Thank you so much. And I think it's duly noted. It's a private to private sector transaction. Thank you so much. And thank you all the panelists for taking the time out. And now I'll hand it over to Umesh and see you guys all in the breakout rooms.
Thank you so much, Basit. I would also like to pay my gratitude to all the speakers of this session. So now we have a group activity ahead, and we will be having 3 groups for that, which also means that we will be having 3 breakout rooms. In this specific auditorium, we are going to have group 2, which will discuss the topic of opportunities and challenges for financing energy transition in Asia. And Rimsha is here. She would be leading the session. So financing RE group would be in this room. Energy efficiency group would be the room across this auditorium. And the group 1, which is which will deal with MDBs, it would be in the 3rd breakout room. All right. So just to clarify again, group 2 financing RE will be here. Energy efficiency group would be in breakout room 2, and MDBs group would be in breakout room 3. Rimsha, over to you.
I would request everyone to come forward because we're going to divide ourselves in further groups so that we can do this small group activity or group work or just a reflection of what we have been learning since the morning. So aap sab log kindly, if you guys can move forward so that then we can divide ourselves in smaller groups. नहीं इधर just put them here हम लोग वो Okay, so what we're going to do is that we're going to be divided in two groups. So I have just displaying this here on the presentation so that we can see how the activity structure will look like. We're going to have two groups, and in the first part, we'll discuss the challenges that you all have heard from our panelists, from our guests since the morning, and then we're going to discuss the opportunities. That's how we're going to go about it. Yeah. So I'll just give some context specifically towards the RE financing aspect, and then we'll do the group work. And then finally, the groups can come here and also share their insights from what they have learned. So just to give a little context of the role of RE financing specifically in Asia, we have been learning about this from our esteemed guests and panelists in the morning. But specifically, I would like to point out here is the sort of a structure that is needed in terms of energy transition. So this structure that you see here is the one that was adopted by China specifically. And you see in the left side, we have green finance, and on the right side, we have energy transition. And the boxes that are in between is basically shows the factors that are needed towards energy transition in terms of green finance specifically. So there are multiple sources for green finance. It could be green credit, green investment, insurance, as well as government support. And then how it goes ahead is informed of direct financial support, infrastructure development, and technological innovations. So this is the sort of a context that I wanted to build here, that in order to achieve our targets that we have currently, that one of them is the doubling of climate finance, and of them is the tripling climate finance. What we need to see here is that there are certain role that each stakeholder needs to play. But first, we would like to highlight and for that, we're going to divide ourselves in groups here. And how it's going to work is that we'll be dealing with two sort of further themes. First, we need to identify the challenges for financing energy transition at regional and global level. And in the next part, we'll see it. At the global level. In the first part, it's the national and local level, and then it's the regional and global level. So I would request if you guys can divide yourselves into two groups, since all of us are sitting in that way. Basit, if you can help in that context. So we're approximately, I think, अगर आप लोग भी यहाँ आ जाए, you guys can come here. So
Okay, so basically just wanted to highlight what we want to achieve. There are going to be two breakout sessions, one at this day and the one next day. The idea of this breakout session is that we want to come up with a final product or sort of like get your feedback and input into a central charter of demand by a global south that essentially could be presented later on. So that is something that we as a coalition and all the partners are working upon. So we would like to really get your feedback on. You have gone through all these sessions to kind of highlight what are the key challenges, what are the key things, and what are the key demands that should come arise. So that's how we have structured this whole group work. So I would like to, request everyone to kind of split into two groups. So maybe one group can come on this side and the other group can come on that side. So me and Rimsha will kind of guide you through the process as we go along. So please pick your groups. Thank you. Pick any group.
So in the first part, what we want you guys to do is that we want you to specifically look at the challenges for financing energy transition at the local and national level. Please read that as local and national. So first, in the first part, you can have 10 minutes approximately, and we want you to identify what specific regulatory, financial, and infrastructure challenges that you have your inputs from, or you have identified that hinders the flow of investments in these RE projects at local and national levels, and specifically in context of Asia. And how do you think that these challenges actually vary across different countries in Asia, not just specifically to Pakistan, but also other countries in Asia, as you have heard from our panelists today, from from Bangladesh perspective, India's perspective, Chinese perspective. So you can look at this. So this is just a guiding question for you, and you can identify 2 to 3 challenges that are specifically at a local and national level. And in the next part, we look at global level. So you have around 5 to 6 minutes, and you can write them down in front of in the posters that you have in front of you, the whiteboards. And at the end, we'll take insights from you all. We just have 2 minutes for this, then we'll move to the next part. So just write it down, 3 or 4 major challenges that you see at the local and national level. Okay, since we are running really short on time, so I would just request everyone to see the next part of it. Since you have identified and written very well specific local and national level challenges, we will now, we would want to see your input at what the challenges that you see at the global level or at Asia specific regional level. So the guiding question here is basically what are the key challenges, key geopolitical, economic, and technological risks and barriers that impede the mobilization of international finance. So all these words, what you see is some complex words here, but what we are trying to identify from your point of view here is that what sort of barriers that you feel are present at a regional level, at Asia specific level, and also at global level. And then just to guide your thought process on this part, you can see it in form of geopolitical issues, you can see it in form of economical issues, then you can also see in terms of technological risks. So we have 5 to 6 minutes more for this part, and then we'll move on to the opportunities. Thank you. Okay, everyone. So now we'll move to the next part. I'm sure you all have written some excellent, have had some excellent discussions and identified the major challenges or the barriers that you have learned today or what was missing from the conversations today. And now what we want to do is that we want to see the opportunities that you feel are there in the global economy or at the regional economy. So what we are going to do is that we have already given some insights in terms of opportunities in what context that you can discuss. So we are going to discuss the opportunities in three major directions. First one, we want to see the private capital aspect, then we will see the public capital, and lastly the development finance. So we'll do this very quickly so that we can you can discuss the inputs on all the three directions. The first one is basically unlocking private capital. So as a guiding question, again, we have drafted it in forms of that how can policymakers and financial institutions create an enabling environment to mobilize the private sector investment in Asia's renewable energy sector. And if you see in the bracket, I have also written some sort of guiding factors or elements that you can discuss. There are many others, but for example, few of them are like green bonds, as we have discussed. Then there are de-risking instruments such as guarantees. Then there's crowdfunding platforms. So see the opportunities first in the context of private capital, and just take 2 to 3 minutes to write some one or two opportunities that you see in the private sector. Just to help you guys a little more, just identify one or maximum two private capital opportunities to unlock this private sector investment. Just one or two maybe. everyone. I would request you guys if you can note it down on your papers, and then we'll move to the next part. The next part is basically unlocking public capital. So now we want you to focus specifically on what strategies can governments in Asia employ to optimize public funding for energy transition. And there again, as a guiding elements, we have written those in the context, as you can see below, specifically in terms of what state governments can do in Asia or your country specifically. For example, what sort of budgeting they can do specifically for climate financing, or what sort of tax credits can they optimize, and then also public-private partnerships. So identify one or two, maximum two opportunities that are public capital specifically. Okay, everyone. So we'll just move to the last part of our activity today. And now I just want you guys to think the opportunities in terms of unlocking development finance. So first we looked at the local or the national level opportunity, the challenges, then we looked at the national level. And now what we want to see is the unlocking development finance, that how can international development finance institutions or multilateral development banks such as World Bank or ADB or AIB, and also the different funds that are available, such as the GCF fund or the GEF fund, and there are multiple international platforms. How can these institutions and banks can provide support for Asia's energy transition? And in that context, we have given you some points that you can discuss about, for example, concessional finance versus grants. Then what are the de-risking instruments that are available or should be available? And also in terms of how can these institutions play a part in knowledge sharing for the Asia. So you can highlight 2 to 3, 1 or 2 maybe, or maximum 3 opportunities that you'll discuss here, and this will be the last part. And after that, after this activity, we'll ask you to provide your inputs to us, what you have written down or noted down. Thank you. So we're almost out of time since we only had 1 hour for this activity. What I want to do now, we are at the we have ended this activity basically, and we want you guys to basically give us your feedback in terms of one major challenge and one major opportunity that you collectively have identified or have found out to be most significant. So one challenge and one opportunity from each group. Anyone from your group can present it or explain it or discuss it with us. There could be only one representative. So I'll after like a minute you can discuss, and after like a minute I'll give the mic to group 1 and then to group 2. Most priority. Both, you can discuss on both. Is that, for example, that if we only discuss at the national or local level, then that's much priority. So I'm going to give the mic to the group 1 first, and then we'll ask the group 2 to give their insights. Maybe you can.
Okay, so hello, we are basically going to share this responsibility of coming up to stage and discussing different things that we noted down along different areas. So the first one is around the challenges that are hindering the investments or flow of investments in RE or climate financing basically. So the first point that we have kind of written under that is the legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks and their cohesiveness for climate financing. So it was also discussed in the panel that this can really be very relevant to whether if some project is conceived, whether it's falling under some already any policy frameworks that's in the country. If it's not, then maybe probably it's not going to be that attractive for the investors to kind of consider. So the second thing that was also highlighted in the panel discussion is Mr. Hamza, I think rightly pointed it out that integrated planning approach is missing in the South Asian countries for the grid level as well as for the off-grid level, and that is another factor that's kind of impacting the financing in these areas. The third one is the political turmoil and economic challenges, as well as the lack of coordination of regional and at the local as well as regional levels. So another thing that I think can be incorporated in there is lack of cooperation, coordination, or I would say cohesiveness of the goals among different state actors. So we kind of also, it was like also pointed out that different ministries within same economy can be working in the same area, but they can have different priorities or goals. So that is something also which doesn't give out a very good signal to the investors. So that can also hinder the flow of investments. So for the second point, I would like to request any of members from my team to come up and share their views. I think I can sum this up if we are short on time. So for the second one, the challenges that we have identified are basically country-specific funds alignment with NDCs.
Just to discuss the opportunities part.
Yeah. Okay.
Just,
Okay. We can
highlight
go to
one
the
or two
opportunities.
that your group have identified.
So for the public sector, I think there can be there's this opportunity with creating a public fund by the government through federal or provincial resources that maybe are in surplus or maybe that can be kind of created to provide investment opportunities. That's one. There can be a taxation mechanism that can be introduced for the power plants that use fossil fuels to kind of discourage and encourage financing for the renewable sector. There can be tax incentives for the industries which are on the transition path with respect to climate to spur economic growth. And with respect to international DFIs, there can be debt relief for the climate financing, concessional financing and grants, as well as multilateral, which can work together, and they can provide de-risking instruments. And further, they can maybe also offer capacity building initiatives on the climate change. So these are a few opportunities that maybe can be considered in order to kind of spur the economic growth at individual economic levels, as well as for the regional transition as a whole. So yeah.
Thank you, Group One. What I have seen is that one challenge that is the most prominent one is towards the planning, and in terms of opportunities, there's terms of need for more funds and a collaborative approach between them. Now we'll move to the Group Two. If you can quickly highlight one or two challenges that you have identified as a priority, and then the opportunities. And just be really quick because we are almost over with our time.
So I think I should summarize the whole scenario in 3 to 5 lines, I guess. So we actually highlighted several challenges, and major of them, Hamad just had discussed them. So I think I should highlight, according to my perspective, one of the major challenges that are in the way of green financing. I think it's the capacity building and lack of skilled experts who can actually, implement complete projects. And secondly, I believe that one of the challenge is that is actually the one of the challenge, and the other challenge is actually the regulatory frameworks, because if there are not positive policies, then investors are not going to invest in renewable energy projects because they think that their investments will not be safe. So talking about the opportunities, how we can offset such uncertainties in the way of renewable energy, I believe the government should incentivize fossil fuel projects and provide leeway on green renewable projects so they can be easily implemented. Secondly, government should, just like RF is doing Markla School on Energy, I think such projects should be implemented on a global scale. So, the youngsters should be trained regarding the renewable energy, climate change, and its, profound impact on the company's economy and, their energy transition goals. And third, I personally believe is that, the stakeholders, especially the private firms and the government stakeholders, should, have the desire, they should be guided, like what are the potential impacts of renewable energy projects and how they are going to help, the country in the longer run. So these are the points I think are better for Pakistan as well and for the other countries in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, both the groups. There's definitely a need for a round of applause for you all. So what we have actually concluded our group activity, and I just want to reiterate the fact that the work that you have done today will be actually utilized in tomorrow's group activity again, because the challenges and opportunities that are actually discussed or taken from your input are going to be used to formulate a charter of demand. So we'll convert these opportunities and challenges in form of demands in tomorrow's group activity. We'll be divided in the same groups. And then finally, at the concluding ceremony, we'll present a charter of demand that will actually be used for COP28. And so thank you everyone for participating and giving your valuable insights. There are definitely some great recommendations as well as opportunities that were highlighted with from you all, and we'll keep it noted down with us for tomorrow's activity again. Thank you. वो कर दें, फोल्ड कर दें ताकि वो मिक्स ना हो. So we'll have the second plenary session starting at 4:15. So there's a tea break going on right now. If anybody wants to have like a tea, it's is it there, or it's the plenary session is going to happen in the same room that we are sitting in. So the second plenary session will start in like about 5 minutes. So you all can keep sitting here and we'll start with the next session after 5 minutes.